Hi everyone, Martin here and welcome to The Loop. Welcome to part 3 of the Pico drone. In this part we're going to talk about this stuff. We'll talk about the filter, the delay looper, the D2A and the output stage. So it's a bit of hardware discussion and a little bit more talk about the coding. So buckle up and okay, let's start with the mixer. We've got 14 signals to add together. So let's go and have a look at the code and how that works. Oh, that's a mixer, you prat. Okay, let's look at the mixer. We saw before in the previous video that the 14 oscillators all get added to this thing called signal total, or sig total. So the mixer, in its very simplest form, is just this value sig total, which gets added to. In C, if you do a plus equals, it sort of adds on. So the signal total just gets added on the signal from the oscillator times by the amplitude, for whichever voice. And then we can use that variable signal total for the next phase. So actually the mixer in itself is just an addition. But this amp variable here, it does really belong to a later discussion in terms of the ADSR, but I will just whiz up here to another bit of code and we can see what actually happens to this amplitude. There's another variable called amps. And what amps does is the variable that comes from the ADSR for each oscillator, because it's a variable. It's an array, so there's actually 14 variables here. We add a little total. So what I'm doing is I'm adding together all the values of all the amplitudes, because you might have pressed down all 14 keys, in which case we want all 14 oscillators to be heard. But if they all go at full volume, that's not going to work. The maximum volume is actually 8192. So what this little bit of code does here is it normalizes the amplitudes. So if the amplitudes all add up to less than 8191 or 8192, then you haven't used up the full A to D, or they haven't used up the full D to A potential. So you can have all those amplitudes as they are. If you've gone over, then this will essentially normalize them. So if you've got 14 oscillators fully loud, the total amplitude will still only be 8192. So that's just the little subtlety of the mixer, that there's a little bit of code running in the background, fiddling with the amplitudes to make sure that they're normalized. I can't actually demonstrate the mixer in any way because it's entirely internal to the system. So now we can move on to the filter. I built the A stable from the last video so that we can have a look at filters. Let's talk a little bit about capacitors, electrical capacitors. They have this symbol, which looks like this, electrical symbol, which is like this, 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 this. And we know that they store up electric charge. So perhaps we could view that as some kind of water tank. So a big tank like this. Maybe it's got an outlet of some description. And what we do is we get some sort of, I don't know, supply of water. And it comes along the pipe, comes along this pipe. This is the analogy anyway, and here's your tank. And this water sort of splashes in. And as we splash the water or electrical charge, the tank fills up. And then at some point we decide, oh, I think we'll let this go. And then we get rid of this here. And then all this sort of water flows out again. That's a fairly good analogy for a capacitor, but I would argue that actually it's slightly different. I think we need to view it more as two tanks. here's our tank that we were talking about before, and our little pipe that comes out. And inside our tank, or our capacitor, is electrical charge. Lots of it. Positive charge, lots of charges. They're all charging up in here. And what that does is gives us a certain voltage level. The more charge we pour in, the higher the voltage. But the other tank we've got to think about is the one that's actually supplying the charge. So maybe I've got a voltage level up here. So this is the supply voltage. And actually these two tanks are joined together. Instead of in the previous example where we saw it sort of pouring in, we actually have a relationship between these two tanks. And this one might have a higher voltage level, V1. Let's call that one V2. So if V1 is above V2, then we know what's going to happen. V2 is going to rise. But if V1 is below, then we know that the voltage on V2 is going to drop, because much as gravity, the charge is going to flow back in the opposite direction. So the charge will flow this way. So what we have is actually a relationship between two tanks. And if we were to plot that on a graph by adding a resistor as well, we might see something like this. So we have a battery. And our battery is going to go through some kind of resistor. Then it's going to come to our capacitor. Like this. And then go back round. Battery. So what's going to happen to the voltage here? V. Across the capacitor. Well, if the capacitor is completely discharged, then to start with, the voltage across here is going to be 0. It has to be 0 because there's no charge, it's like a battery, there's nothing in it. This is time, this is voltage. Time, volts. Okay, so to start with, there's no charge in the capacitor and voltage is 0. But over time, there's a fixed current or a maximum current which relates to the resistance of this resistor that can flow into the capacitor. So to start with, it's almost as if there's a short circuit, and current I would be the battery voltage, VB, VB, divided by the resistance R. So the maximum current that can flow is VB divided by R. But as this voltage rises, the current I will actually be equal to VB minus V divided by R. So the amount of charge that can flow into our capacitor is actually proportional to how charged it is. And anything that's proportional to something else is going to end up leaving us with an exponential. It's going to go like this. So to start with, the voltage rises rapidly, and then as time goes on it tails off. Funnily enough, voltage in the capacitor can never actually be the same as the voltage of the battery. It's impossible for it to ever get there. Let's look now at the case where we're going to discharge this capacitor. I've opened a switch here and then I've connected this to ground. So the current is now going to flow out of the capacitor because there's a resistor here, and this has now reached something close to VB, the battery voltage. So let's look at the voltage over time in this situation. We're going to start up here at VB. And what we know is that the moment the voltage will be at its highest, so therefore the current that can flow through resistor R is at its maximum. But exactly in reverse to the charging situation, as we go on, the voltage will reduce, the current will reduce, and the rate of loss of charge will reduce. So again, we have an exponential. Let's now put a square wave into our resistor-capacitor combination and measure the voltage across the capacitor. So here's our voltage. It's going to be a square, like this. And what's going to happen is if we pretend that the capacitor wasn't charged to start with, it's going to charge up with our exponential to very nearly that voltage. Then when the voltage starts to drop, we've got the opposite exponential as the capacitor discharges, and then the same again as it charges up, and the same again as it discharges. So you can see our resistor capacitor has kind of knocked the edges off the square wave. And let's have a little listen to that now. What you hear there is the actual amplitude of the signal reducing, so it's getting quieter. And that's because we're losing some of the high frequencies. Also, the tone is changing as well, and that's pretty much how the passive tone control works on an electric guitar. It just the capacitor takes some of the high frequency stuff down to ground via a variable resistor. In the next clip here, you're going to see a frequency sweep, and you'll see as the frequency rises, the volume is going to go down even more. The reason being, all that charge is trying to rush into the capacitor, and so, I've got to rush out again, I've got to rush in, I've got to rush out, and it just can't do it. And the faster it's expected to run in and run out, the more of it you're going to lose in the resistor, because the difference in voltage is greater, and with the greater voltage difference, the higher the current, and the higher the current, the more it's got to rush in and rush out, and the more voltage you lose across the resistor. This is becoming rather a long video, for which I apologise, but we've got one more component that I really need to talk about, which is the inductor. So an inductor sometimes has, more often than not, has a kind of metal or ferrite kind of core, and then around this core is a coil of wire. A fairly familiar thing you'd see inside the motor, inside your electric drill or food blender or whatever. But there are also chokes inside fluorescent tubes and things like that. And what happens with an inductor is you pass a current into the inductor, and initially it has to create a magnetic field. So whilst it's creating this magnetic field, the voltage across here is actually the same as the voltage of the supply, Vs. So, although this wire has a very, very small electrical resistance, to start with, there's a very, very tiny current, because all of the energy is going into creating this magnetic field. Then once this magnetic field is actually created, this then looks, from a DC perspective, like the resistance of the wire, which is very, very which is very, very low. It's a matter of a few ohms. It depends on how much wire there is. So the graph of voltage against time for this would be start at Vs. So this is actually similar to capacitor in that it stores energy, but its voltage starts at the opposite end. The voltage starts quite high, and then the voltage drops away. And the reason it drops away, we'd need a resistor here. The reason it drops away is that this eventually represents the electrical resistance of the wire. So we change from its impedance, which starts at infinity, and its impedance will go down to 0 once the magnetic field is built. Now I'm going to switch off Vs. I'm going to break the connection here. We know that the voltage has gone down to 0. So what happens when we break the connection? And in fact, what happens is this magnetic field collapses. And then it's almost as if we'd, in some ways, pushed a magnet in here and then pulled it out. When we pull it out, we actually get a voltage in the opposite direction, like that. Let's look at our final circuit diagram, where we have the inductor, capacitor, V in, V out. Now with this configuration, we know that with a capacitor and a resistor, as the frequency increases, the voltage here will go down and down and down. So that forms a low-pass filter. We've also just looked at the inductor and seen that the inductor starts with a very, very high impedance. And it's only when the magnetic field is created that it can actually have a very low impedance or a very low resistance. So together, these two are going to block high frequency. This one because it has a high impedance, and this one because it has a very low impedance when it comes to alternating current. But there's one other fascinating situation that can occur with these two, which is this one's storing up energy, and so is this one. So if the frequency is right, and it matches the capacity to store energy between these two, then there can be some kind of resonance. And as this resonates, we know that this one also will return the voltage in the opposite direction. So this is how we end up with a resonant filter. And I'll show you now what happens. I'll show you now what happens when we attach a circuit like this to my A-stable. Before we get back to the code, let's have a quick look at the maths of a filter. So in my picture here, I've got our waveform, which has actually been cut into discrete samples, P1, P2, P3. So these are the incoming voltages or values that make up our square waveform. And here we have at the same point our filtered values, which at the moment we don't know, so I've just scattered them about, V1, V2, V3. So the P are the incoming values, and the V's are the outgoing values. So to calculate V2, we need to pretend it's almost like a capacitor. So P2 is, if there's no filter, P2 is the value that V2 would take. But actually, we want to filter this out, so we want to have to charge up from the last value. And the way we do that is we say, well, what's the difference? What's the difference between where you want to be and where I was. This is where I was, this is where I want to go. The bigger this distance, the more we're going to charge up, or the faster that current's going to flow into the capacitor, and the higher the voltage difference will be. So if A was 0, or actually, which actually represents an enormous capacitor, if this was 0, this term disappears, and V2 would always be equal to V1. So V2 would always be equal to V1. And what that would be saying is that if V1 starts at 0, it would always be 0. So it wouldn't really matter what P was doing, our output would always be 0. If A was 1, then the V1 term would disappear, and V2 would always be P2. So V2 would be P2, and V3 would be P3. And in this case, it's almost as though we have no filter. We'd follow this exactly. So a carefully chosen value of A will give us a low-pass filter. And that's like a first-order filter. We can go on adding terms to this from more and more from previous. So V3 could depend on V2 and V1. And this will make the filter sharper in terms of its response. But that's the kind of mathematics we'd be looking for to code a filter. Let's have a look at the filter code here. What you can see is I've followed approximately the mathematics that we were talking about, but done it in a different way. I think I've done it differently, one, because I want to do something, experiment with something different, and secondly, because it's actually really, really efficient. So what I've got is a little variable called df, which is the difference between the current signal, the one that I want, and the previous signal. You can see the previous signal gets set here after the filter. So this value sigtp is available for next time we come round. And then instead of doing all that multiplication and this value A, I've just taken a value for the filter, which is how filtered I want it to be. And I'm saying if the difference between now and the last time is greater than the filter value, then actually you're only allowed to be the previous value plus the filter. And the same if you're trying to go, so that's if you're trying to go very positive. If you're trying to go negative, you can only go as negative as the filter value. So what this is doing is actually kind of triangle waving off the triangle wave. So if you want to slew at this rate, this is saying, well, as long as you're below the rate that I allow, you're fine. If you try and go faster than that, I'm not going to let you. So a triangle that's trying to go like that will actually go, as you decrease this value of the filter, you're only going to be allowed to change by only a certain amount. Let's have a listen to it, and also listen to it with the VCO. I think at this point this is probably enough for this video, and we'll talk about the D2A and various other things in the next video. I promised at the beginning of this video to talk about the mixer, the filter, the delay looper, the D2A and the output stage. Unfortunately this video got really long. We did the mixer and the filter. So delay looper and the output stage we're going to have to do in the next part. I hope you enjoyed the diversion. It wasn't supposed to be a lesson in analog electronics, but that's where it went. So hang on for part 2. I'll give you a little taster of some of those functions. The delay looper. I'll give you a taste of some of those functions now as we play this out. So once again, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time on the other loop.